Chapter 12 of Erickson, God's Plan, further develops his omni-attributes in terms of how he guides our life, what he knows, what he determines. Again, one of those classical questions that Christians have as to how to explain this eternal, all-knowing God relating to us who live in this continuum where our thinking proceeds from one thought to the next. Is called discursive thinking, where we don't know everything all at once, but where from one point to the next we don't know about tomorrow. So how does an all-knowing God relate to this? When I say define God's plan, that's basically just a statement Erickson makes on page 122 when he says we may define the plan of God as his eternal decision, rendering certain all things that will come to pass. So that broadly is the idea of God's plan. And he then goes on to discuss the difference between predestinate and foreordain. Predestinate, he says, relates to God's specific acts or his specific intentions to accomplish certain purposes, while foreordain is a more general term in which God determines generally what is going to come to pass to fit in his overall plan. And a little bit difficult to see the differences there, but it's the idea that sometimes certain things God specifically determines and other things he allows to develop in a way that is free and yet within harmony with his general will. And my question, how do you feel about Erickson's assessment of the Old Testament view of God's plan? Basically, all he does here is simply describe the fact that to the Old Testament, everything is planned by God, even the rain, the storms, that God is responsible for everything. That is an optional view that one could have of God and God's plan. It's not necessarily wrong. A question might be to what extent God is actively involved in everything. Some of us would feel that God does allow a certain measure of freedom so that he might not determine every rainfall that takes place, but that he allows all things to develop freely in conformity with his overall general will for humanity. I like number 4 here, what are the implications of Genesis 50:20? Because this really has a message for us as we look at the events of our own lives. Genesis 50:20 is the well-known example of Joseph when his brothers encounter him, and it's that well-known story that they sold him into slavery, put him in this hole in the ground, and he was picked up by some herders and by some nomads, and eventually found his way into executive standing in the court of Pharaoh. And his brothers then encountered him when they were journeying to Egypt to try to get food to help the family during a time of famine. And so Joseph, in the account in chapter 50, reveals himself to his brothers. And they're terrified then that now this great official in Egypt is that same brother whom they left in a hole in the ground to die. They're wondering what's going to happen. And Joseph reassures them. And he says, "Fear not." This is in Genesis 50, verse 19. "And Joseph said unto them, Fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive." And I think this is great comfort for our lives, because we will experience evil, and we will experience mistreatment, but God may mean it for good. And we'll comment on that in a minute about Romans 8:28. But the point is that sometimes people may mean evil to us, but God can work it for good. And we need to be very trusting in that. So what are 2 ways of viewing Romans 9 through 11? This is that great predestinarian chapter, as you know, when he says, "For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate," etc., etc. Romans chapters 9 and 11 talk about God's electing Jacob and Esau according to his decree of election. So the real question is, how do we view God's election? Is Romans 9 through 11 teaching that you personally have been elected by God, or is there a broader sense in which this might be understood? And the suggestion has been made that we shouldn't overly individualize it, but rather see Romans 9 through 11 as God's choice of a specific nation, the nation of Israel, to be elected to serve his people. So it's possible Romans 9 through 11 may not be teaching that you individually have a special standing, but rather that it is the church and that it is the nation of Israel as God's chosen messengers that have a very special place, a very special understanding from God. And then what is the difference between Calvinism and Arminianism? Some differences here. Calvinism is going to understand predestination absolutely, and Calvinism is going to say that your decisions are really determined by God. Arminianism generally, and by that word Arminianism, what we're really talking about probably is more the theology of John Wesley and his view of theology than Arminianism technically from a historical point of view that goes back to a man contemporary with the time of Calvin named Jacobus Arminius. When we talk about Arminianism, generally we're talking about Wesleyan theology. The idea that we come to God freely, He knows us, but He has not predestined everything. Arminianism would teach that God is in control of everything, but it's based on His foreknowledge, not the idea that He has determined it, but that He previously knows the results of our choices and then arranges our lives in compliance with that. Maybe a little bit of unnecessary theologizing there. The idea is, how does God know? That might lead to the statement in Romans 8:28, 29. How do we understand that? And see, if one looks at Romans 8:28 and 29, here's what the writer says, Paul, "We know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to His purpose. For whom He did foreknow, He also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of His Son, that He might be the firstborn among many brethren." So there's two ways of understanding this. The classical Calvinistic way would be that those people who God foreknew, He also predestinated foreknowledge. So for whom He did foreknow, He also did predestinate, implying that our actions are based upon God's foreknowledge of our free choice. However, a Calvinist will point out that this word foreknow may have a stronger meaning. There is a word in the Old Testament to indicate the depth of knowing. So-and-so loved his wife, so-and-so knew his wife, and this is a very deep knowing. And you could translate this, for whom He did forelove, He also did predestinate. So you see, here we have two different theological traditions coming somewhat at odds over this. And I would suggest to either one of these, I really don't care which option you might take. The idea is that God does know us and God does take care of us. I might add, there is an option for understanding God's relating to our beings, and that is to see God as having three different types of knowledge. One could talk about God's absolute knowledge, which consists of all things that are necessarily true and expressive of His being, the idea of the laws of logic, laws of science, laws of mathematics. For example, 2 plus 2 will always equal 4, never equal 6. It's the idea that there are certain absolute things that are true that reflects the way God made this world. And then there is what might be called God's ordained knowledge. And this is His general determination to allow our lives to reach certain developments in His plan and His redemption. Certain purposes He has determined for us, and He has determined good and not evil. But some would say that in between God's absolute knowledge and God's ordained knowledge, which is His plan for you personally, there also is a thing called middle knowledge, which is an area that God has chosen not to extensively know. He does not choose to extensively know, for example, the color of shirt you're going to buy, the kind of car you're going to drive, all the little decisions you're going to make in your life. So there's an area called God's middle knowledge where He does not operate with extensive knowledge, but what He does possess is His ordained will, which means your life is going to glorify God. So I don't know if that helps or not. I'm not entirely opposed to that view, but it doesn't hurt to say that God is in control of everything, and I would accept whatever verdict you choose to make about that, realizing that this is not an easy subject to